Hello everybody! You have just stumbled upon the fourth of my series of Kingdom Hearts retrospective review thingies, this one detailing with the fourth game in the series, Kingdom Hearts 358 Days Over 2. For full context going into this, it's highly suggested you are familiar with the four games up to this point, being Kingdom Hearts Final Mix, Rechain of Memories, and Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. This is going on the assumption that you are largely familiar with the previous trilogy of games, and as such will contain spoilers for all four games. If you're okay with this and would like my summary/thoughts on this title, then welcome aboard and stay tuned. I have previously done 3 to 5 hour videos on my thoughts on said previous 3 games, and this will be much shorter thanks to the nature of this title, so they're linked around if you're curious as to my perspective coming into this game. Now for a bit of preamble before diving into the actual video. Kingdom Hearts 358 Days Over 2, henceforth known mostly as Days, was originally released worldwide for the Nintendo DS in 2009. This was the first of 3 handheld games announced after the first 3 games released, and were positioned to explain events surrounding the first trilogy. A prequel, interquel, and sequel were all announced, and Days is the interquel, taking place near the end of Kingdom Hearts, runs concurrent through Chain of Memories, and leads right up to the beginning of Kingdom Hearts 2. As such, when it came time for Square Enix to remaster all the games in HD for the remix collections, a dilemma was had for the company. While PlayStation 2 games were easy enough to clean up since they began in a 3D state that held the series' signature art style and were easier to clean up, Days was a product of the Nintendo DS. Now, I love the handheld, but the graphics on there as far as 3D was concerned is more akin to PlayStation 1 era polygons than anything remotely close to the PS2. As such, if Square Enix were to make the game playable for its 1.5 HD Remix collection, bundling Days alongside Kingdom Hearts Final Mix and Rechain of Memories, they would essentially have had to remake the entire game, which would have been an extra year or 2 of development time, which wasn't on the timetable for the project. As such, they decided to instead remake the Cliff Notes version of the story and condense the more important cutscene bits into a 3-hour film of sorts, including a few of the details like diary entries and secret reports, while recording new dialogue and trying to present itself as an easy digest for fans who never got to experience the game's narrative. In their own words, the Days film depicts around 70% of the game's story, mainly skimping out a lot of the Disney World shenanigans, but they do get referenced as the usual development of the protagonist thing they always are in this series. This is why this video is going to be much shorter. Since I'm mostly detailing the games as they're seen on the HD Remix collections, I don't have any actual gameplay footage for you this time around. While I can still discuss aspects of the game itself, as I did replay it recently before this, you're going to have to bear with my lack of direct footage on this one, as the experience most will have now going forward is through this patchwork film of sorts. Makes it easy for me and quicker for those who are watching these for a story summary and lore dissection, but I figured I'd let everyone know where I'm coming from on this one and why it's showing up so close to the next game's video. So this isn't the in-depth video you're looking for if you're here for my obsessive discussion on gameplay mechanics and whatnot, like I've done for the first 3 games. This is going to be heavily focused on story and lore aspects with a sprinkling of gameplay thoughts between 2 parts of this video, but otherwise we're summarizing the story and its links to past and future games. If you want, I do have my own edited video of the film that is just over 3.5 hours long if you want to experience the story with inserted character insights, but otherwise you'll be getting an even shorter recap of events here. With all that out of the way, let's begin. After a requisite title screen with a slightly somber flute taking center stage this time around for Dearly Beloved, the opening this time around focused on Organization 13, as Days promptly centers around Roxas's time there, filling in a bit of why this game's called what it is, but not why it's pronounced 358 Days Over 2. It lists off each of the 13 members with a brief description of their personalities, showcases their weapons, attributes, and titles alongside their number, all set to Sanctuary, which is still a big no-no on YouTube. All the footage is from Rechain of Memories and Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix, so there's a reason I suggest this one after Kingdom Hearts 2 and not before it, though you will gain an alternate appreciation if you go Days first, then 2. This mainly stems from me usually doing this in release order, and a lot of Days' details deals with the connections and hints at future games, but you can technically have this be your 3rd or 4th title. Anyways, the game opens with the last conversation Roxas and Axel had towards the end of Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. Again, full spoilers ahead. Talking about whether or not Roxas actually has a heart, it then flashes back to day 255, beginning in medias res on the now familiar clock tower in Twilight Town. After a bit of a friendly back and forth, depicting that friendship the two were said to have had in 2, alongside the main framework of the title, Roxas keeps track of how many days he's existed since he joined up with Organization 13, before we roll back promptly to day 7. A lot of this will be a bit jarring for newcomers, but the game will attempt to fill in a lot about what's going on, but for now you're along for the first big surprise for returning fans. Put simply, our main protagonist this time around is Roxas, from which the majority of the story will revolve around, which belongs to an Organization 13 of black-coded anime characters. In the round room, where all 13 members of the organization are alive for, the organization's superior, Xemnas, introduces their newest member, number 14, Shion. Already the questions arise on this new 14th member of Organization 13, something returning fans and newbies alike will likely wonder about. She keeps her hood up, but is otherwise easily recognized as female. Roxas then recalls his first week in diary form, on how he only had a name and nothing much else to go on. Apparently, Roxas was essentially a zombie for the first 7 days of his existence, and is chaperoned by Axel, helping ease Roxas, and thus new players, into what the organization is and what their goal is stated as. In the game, this is where a bunch of tutorials were held, and is thus briefly discussed in the movie here, so I will summarize a bit. Their base of operations is the castle that never was, situated in the world that never was, in the realm between. Roxas is told to hunt down Heartless with his Keyblade, the key-shaped sword he alone has the ability to wield. He is told that they are gathering hearts to create Kingdom Hearts, though he admits he has no idea what it is or what it does, or even why a heart is that important. He is told he is a nobody, and that they were all born without hearts, meaning they don't technically exist. Being told they want hearts and thus must fight the darkness, they use pathways made up of darkness to cross into various worlds into the realm of light, learning about each one and how best to keep a low profile when in them. Roxas becomes familiar with the routine of returning to the castle, which is what they refer to in-game as RTCing, after going out and completing their daily missions. During days 7 through 14, Roxas is tutored by Axel, Marluxia, Zexion, Larxene, Vexen, and Lexius of the organization. This is notable because these are mainly the members who get sent off to Castle Oblivion for the events of Chain of Memories, as those who came from those games knows that 5 of those members will soon be nothing instead of just being nobodies. So this brief window is the only glimpse of all 13 now 14 members seen all together alive. In fact, Roxas pairs up with all but 2 of the 14 members throughout the game, and this is the only time where these 5 can be paired up with before the events of Chain of Memories occur. All the while, Roxas begins to slowly learn about emotions and the concept of friendship, the usual staples of the series. After each mission, Axel takes Roxas up atop the clock tower in Twilight Town to have some sea salt ice cream. Roxas begins to get used to the routine before Axel says he's being sent off with the aforementioned 5 members to Castle Oblivion on day 22. They are being sent there to conduct experiments on memories, as returning players will know, as Nominee is also a thing the story will eventually reintroduce. Before he does, Syx informs Axel that there are traitors being sent alongside him to Castle Oblivion, and is told to eliminate them. Left without the closest thing to a friend he had, Roxas begins conducting missions alongside Shion, who remains hooded and doesn't say too much. Members like Demyx relish how much quieter the castle is without half of their noisier members, while Xigbar continues his shtick of giving nicknames to everybody, much to Roxas's confusion. Eventually, Shion begins to speak to Roxas, and the two begin to interact more, number 14 eventually lifting her hood and revealing to the audience that she looks like a black-haired Kairi. The mystery deepening, Shion eventually reveals that she can wield the Keyblade as well, something she didn't even know she could do. Roxas introduces her to the icing on the cake, as Axel taught him, and treats Shion to his and Axel's afternoon ritual. Day 26 rolls around to the organization being informed that all at Castle Oblivion may have been eliminated, much to Roxas's dismay. Beginning to grapple with the potential loss of Axel and almost half of the organization, Roxas suddenly falls unconscious after a mission with Xigbar, flashes of his new friends and a familiar blonde girl occurring while he recalls his conversation with Xemnas on the Dark Margin, asking about his true name. The next day, Xemnas is checking in on Roxas, asking Syx about his condition. Number 7 says that Roxas will awaken once the hero's memories are taken away from him. Claiming that Shion has gained the power over the Keyblade as they intended, Xemnas continues to watch over Roxas. Curiously, this scene is slightly altered in the HD film, as he originally stood over Roxas, claiming sleep had taken him yet again. Now, there are many smaller scenes omitted in the HD film, but this one in particular relates to the next game, so it always stood out to me why it was left out on the film when it would have added maybe 5 seconds to it, but whatever. Roxas eventually awakens on day 50 with numerous seashells next to him on his bed after dreaming about Sora entering the memory pot at the end of Chain of Memories. It's important to note that Roxas doesn't know who Sora is. I'm simply speaking to you guys in clearer terms. He instinctually heads to the clock tower as Shion fills him in on how long he's been sleeping. Handing him a seashell, both teens relish the familiar sound of the waves. A few weeks pass, and on day 71, Axel suddenly shows up to Roxas at the end of a mission. Overjoyed, Roxas buys both of them some ice cream as Axel reveals that he came back before checking in to sort out his feelings, something Roxas is able to rib him about, with them lacking hearts and whatnot. Roxas fills his friend in on how he's brought along Xion into their ritual. The next day, Saïx berates Axel for not reporting back in immediately, only hearing that Naminé had escaped, something Axel flippantly concurs with. Asking if Axel had found the chamber, Saïx is reminded that it's impossible to search every room of Castle Oblivion, and that he had no luck finding that room. Impressed with Saïx's rounding up of the troublesome traitors, Axel makes a point to confirm that Zexion was dealt with. Seems like Zexion really did learn way too much during the events of Chain of Memories. Later on, Roxas, Axel, and Xion gather together atop the clock tower, finally together. After rescuing her from a Heartless earlier in the day, Xion reveals that she's lost the ability to use the Keyblade. Fearing she'll be turned into a dusk for her uselessness, Axel suggests that Roxas team up with her more often, Roxas pulling in double duty, gathering more hearts to hide her sudden loss of the Keyblade. Xion then asks if she's now friends with Axel. He pauses for a second, confirming the fact. More on this later. Fast forwarding to day 94, Xemnas calls the remaining organization members to the highest point of the castle, showcasing the first glimpse of their crystallized amalgamation of captured hearts. Using the sight of Kingdom Hearts to further motivate the organization into completing it and granting them a new world so that they would no longer be controlled by hearts, Roxas remains confused as to its importance. Axel claims that they're fighting to gain hearts, as they remember what it was like to have them. Roxas admits that while he doesn't quite get why he needs a heart, since he doesn't have one, he agrees that Axel must be right at the end of the day. The two teens are told that each member of the organization has their own strengths. Most importantly is that they all retain their memories of when they were somebodies, which is what makes them special. Curiously, both Roxas and Xion don't recall any memories of their time as people, let alone their earliest memories as nobodies. Axel suggests that this is what makes them even more special, Roxas wondering what type of person he was. As we wrap up the introductory act of days, we have a glimpse at both Naminé and Diz at the mansion in Twilight Town, both important figures of Chain of Memories and Kingdom Hearts 2 officially entering the picture. Now's the time where it's best to reiterate a bunch of gameplay, lore, and backstory information. I'm about to cover a bunch of aspects and throw a ton of lingo at you guys. If you're familiar with the previous 3 games, this will be more of a recap, but it's still a bunch of information, so heads up. As stated before, Axel makes sure Roxas, and thus the player, knows the essentials at the beginning of the game. Their leader's name is Xemnas, the second-in-command is Saïx, who gives out daily missions to each member to various worlds with varied objectives. The new kid is Xion, number 14. One of the organization's main goals is to go out and collect hearts. This is where Heartless are reintroduced. A heart is freed whenever a Heartless is defeated, creatures of sentient darkness of people's hearts, essentially. These creatures actively seek out hearts and are drawn to Keyblade wielders. The organization thus seeks to collect these released hearts and use them to create Kingdom Hearts, an artificial entity that will supposedly help make them all whole again. This is where the differences between Pure Blood and Emblem Heartless are made more clear to those who didn't read the answer reports in earlier games. Pureblood Heartless are naturally born from the darkness in people's hearts, and do not give out hearts when defeated. Emblem Heartless are artificially created from a machine made from Ansem the Wise's apprentices that absorbed many captured hearts and released stronger Heartless that more took on the appearance of creatures and citizens from the worlds they originated in. These Heartless, when defeated, release the hearts that made them, and in-game these Heartless release more hearts the more powerful they are. The Kiki here is reinforcing why Roxas is so vital to the organization. While many characters can defeat Heartless in general, as seen in-game by various party members and even other entities, these hearts eventually will reform back into Heartless. As previously stated in Kingdom Hearts 2, Heartless that are slain by a Keyblade are able to free those hearts, and the organization was able to capture those hearts specifically to create their yellow and artificial Kingdom Hearts. Being an amalgamation of hearts, their goal is to complete this Kingdom Hearts and use it to ensure that they truly, finally exist. As a refresher, each member of the organization are what are known as nobodies. When a strong-willed person succumbs to the darkness in their heart or has their heart stolen, their body can reanimate alongside their soul and become a nobody. According to the universe of Kingdom Hearts, a person, what I designate as a somebody, is made up of 3 vital components: a heart, a soul, and a body. These elements are mixed in with various aspects like memory to help define a complete being. If you are lacking in any of the 3, you aren't considered whole, and nobodies are shells being willed by a person's soul without their heart. The organization is thus gathering hearts to create Kingdom Hearts to give them their own set of hearts back, and become whole people to break free of the hold hearts have over them, according to Xemnas. That's a lot of hearts. That's the basic gist of what Days covers in a short time span. Each game does its best to ease in newer players into its storyline and lore and lingo, often by utilizing an in-game excuse to start a character at level 1. In this case, Roxas is only a week old when you control him, so that's an easy way to start at level 1. That being said, the further along the series goes, the more continuity lockout overrides the ease of entry newcomers will have. Especially for a game like Days, which explicitly fills in a bunch of background information on a major supporting character from 2 and helps shed some light on the antagonists of the second and third games. There's a lot of information for a newcomer to take in, but it's not impossible. My little sister basically got into Kingdom Hearts via Days here, so it's very possible for every entry to get new players and have them get into the series to fill out what they've missed later, which is why these HD remixes exist. Even so, Days was somewhat known to be a confusing story even to those who had played the previous games, which is why I'm here. So far, the story isn't too confusing, but that will change going forward, as even now we've had quite a few references regarding Chain of Memories, and those keeping track of continuity can figure out kind of why Roxas was knocked out earlier for almost a full month. Introducing a 14th member in a group called Organization 13 is a natural eyebrow-raising moment, but for now I'll switch up to a brief overview of the gameplay of the DS original game. Despite being on the DS, Days doesn't play too dissimilarly from the numbered counterparts. Especially compared to the Game Boy Advance version of Chain of Memories, Days is placed in full 3D here, recreating many worlds from the series as locations, though many are made bigger to accommodate for one of the title's biggest features, multiplayer. Up to 4 players can select any member of the organization, making the other 12 playable for the first time, with Xion, Riku, the King, Donald, Goofy, and Sora eventually becoming playable as you play through the game in its mission mode. Enemies are made much more stronger to compensate for the increased player count, but otherwise most missions can be played with another friend, though this feature would have been pretty neat to see remade with an online connectivity feature. What could have been, right? Each player plays distinctly, but each follows a similar gameplay setup from the main game, so there's no insane amounts of customization for each of the 19 playable characters thanks to its panel system. Utilizing the system's lower touchscreen, Days' panel system is what governs a character's equipment and abilities. Eventually unlocking 3 screens to play with, you begin with 15 slots, eventually able to extend this to a maximum of 120 total when fully unlocked, 3 5x8 grids to play around with. Like with Chain of Memories' card system before it, Days' panel system grants the player with more customization options with those limited slots to better prioritize what a player might feel they need for each mission. To start with, leveling is also handled with the panel system. You gain them through gaining experience, sure, but they must be equipped on your panels to take effect. In practice, you can adjust your level at any given time, leading to an interesting bit of customizable difficulty if one so desired. There are also special support panels that can double, triple, and quadruple level up panels. These panels come in specific shapes and must be organized to best efficiently use your limited space. All those years of Tetris came in handy in this department for me. Other abilities are similar. Some staples like dodge, roll, and block can be increased in effectiveness alongside some elemental and stat modifiers. Accessories are limited to rings this time around. Only one can be equipped at once, and you have a wide range of effects, so you've got a lot of options to play around with. This extends to how the game handles weapons. Utilizing gears, and no, this isn't really explained in-universe since it applies to every character here, these are analogous to the keychain system, changing any character's weapon depending on the gear selected. Many allow you to attach units to improve your weapon's capabilities, and there's way too many to list here, as you won't see any of it in this HD film anyways, but know that you have a ton of options in the game, from new keyblade designs, alternates for every organization's weapon, and even ultimates and joke weapons are available through this system. Similarly to the card system, magic and items are only available if you equip them. Magic has accompanying support panels which determine what level your magic is and how many times you can cast them through a mission. It's possible to go into a mission, fail and realize you're up against a ton of fire-based enemies, then retry equipped with blizzard magic and fire-resistant panel buffs. This eliminates the need of an MP bar and instead factors in resource management, similar to how items have always been handled throughout the series. They even added actual limit breaks a la Final Fantasy this time around, and where holding A will unleash each character's specific limit break once your HP drops into a certain yellow range, called the Alarm Zone, as a last-ditch attack effort to stay alive. After each use, the zone creeps further down, requiring you to survive more deadly attacks to trigger again, so risk-reward. There's also a final limit ability given on day 225 that enables you to extend your limit breaks. Normally when triggered, a marker travels down the HP bar, but with final limit it will then reverse, enabling your character to trigger a follow-up limit attack. Days is very customizable overall, as it is possible to play with friends, each player focusing on specific duties, with one could possibly be focusing on magic, one on status effects, and another on all-out attacks. These were good times, but I'd imagine it's way more difficult finding other players for the copy of the game during the publication date of this video and the latter half of 2018. As for the actual gameplay, the 93 total missions do vary in objective with the same handful of goals, so many were relieved to learn that there weren't literally 358 total missions, for that would have been excessive and would have definitely limited the story. As has already been seen, the game isn't afraid to jump forward a few weeks at a time to push along the narrative, so this is a welcome decision to be sure. Objectives range from simple defeat X Heartless to reconnaissance, usually when exploring a new area, and some are more agile tasks like collecting nobody emblems within a certain time limit. Days further utilizes the DS's dual screens by having the map and objectives constantly visible, even utilizing the touchscreen to rotate the camera instead of using the shoulder buttons. Again, being on a handheld lacking a second stick sort of really hurt 3D games like this, especially on the DS where the D-pad was the only input of movement. This is slightly easier with the thumbs when playing on a 3DS nowadays, but the compass directions are still a thing. The strength of the DS is also utilized for story purposes going forward, and I'll be sure to mention them in passing as the story hits them, since they're more nice gameplay boosts that caught me pleasantly by surprise. Overall, the gameplay is fine. It's simplified in comparison to the console games, with more full controller options, but it did bring a lot of the aspects from Kingdom Hearts 2 into handheld form. In particular, many weapons utilize the Y button as a combo alternative, since Kingdom Hearts operates largely on two attack buttons, a normal attack and a second one that varies per game. While there were reaction commands in Kingdom Hearts and Kingdom Hearts 2, it's the combo button here, which varies up your attacks with more variety and carries across to every character. It may have been cramp-inducing with longer missions, but the fun I had with friends and family when the game was the newest Kingdom Hearts title in years was almost worth the pain. Of course, the campaign is the main draw here, especially now for archival purposes. You can achieve various levels of satisfying an objective, but can sometimes go above and beyond a mission, such as defeating all Special Heartless or challenging an optional super boss after your main mission is complete. Its presentation was also pretty impressive for the DS in 2009, much like Chain of Memories was for the GBA back in 2004. Square Enix is a lot of things, but they definitely go all out for the biggest franchises, especially when Nomura is involved. After every mission, they even have the whole throne thing, and they each raise according to how many hearts you gathered in a mission. This is mostly non-canon, but it's also been said by the director himself that the thrones kind of can be adjusted at will by any member, but they kind of stay under Xemnas purely for intimidation/respect purposes. I'll address a few of the game's cons in comparison to its pros later on, but for now let's return to the second act of Days, where the plot begins to really thicken in earnest, and starts losing newcomers in jargon and Kingdom Hearts themes. We resume the story on day 96, where Roxas and Xion were informed by Saïx that they were no longer to be working together on missions. Roxas had lent Xion his Keyblade for their mission at Beast Castle, relying solely on magic in the hopes that she would regain the ability to wield it once more before having to part. Trying again, Xion was able to summon her Keyblade. The overjoyed duo rush off to the clock tower to thank Axel for his idea. A bit flustered, the older organization member attempts to ground them in slightly optimistic cynicism.
For a bunch of nobodies like us. But it's okay if things change and we can't meet up here.
Huh?
As long as we keep each other in our thoughts, none of us will ever have to be apart. Got it memorized?
Wow, that was so not you.
Hey!
A few weeks pass as day 117 rolls around, beginning with Saïx letting himself into Axel's room, demanding to know what Xion's been up to, Axel unwilling to spy on his friends. Saïx personally informs Axel that he is to be sent to Castle Oblivion to find the chamber, though Axel finds the idea fruitless since they have scoured the castle's halls many times before, searching for all of its secrets to no avail. Saïx then gives Axel more incentive to return, dropping the bombshell that Xion originates from Castle Oblivion, just as Naminé does. In true fashion, Axel once again cuts to the quick, claiming Cyax is actually the one who wants to search Castle Oblivion the most in regards to finding out what Xemnas' true agenda is. Name-dropping the Chambers of Repose and Waking, Cyax wishes to discover what link they share and to indeed figure out what Xemnas hasn't been telling them. The assassin reminds his accomplice that he personally made sure Vexen and Zexion were eliminated to make way for Cyax's climb to the top, hinting at the implication the two had known each other for a while, earlier hinted at in Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. This further hints at deeper machinations regarding Cyax and Axel, since both Vexen and Zexion's deaths in Chain of Memories now have been given more substance, even though Axel did play it off as collateral damage at the time. While Roxas was out with Xigbar searching for new worlds looking for other nobodies to find potential organization candidates, to make up for the members they lost no doubt, Xion confides in Axel that when she talks to Roxas, it begins to stir up distant feelings of watching the sunset alongside someone else by the sea. The two discuss the importance of memories, how they never seem to do much good for Axel, while Xion wonders if she and Roxas were more connected than they realize. The next day leads to their first vacation, Roxas having no clue what to do with all of his free time. Eventually ending up in Twilight Town, Roxas witnesses the local kids, the familiar trio of Hayner, Pence, and Olette from Kingdom Hearts 2. Axel detailing how summer vacation works, Roxas then gives an ironic comment. While Roxas and Xion had no idea how to fill their day, Axel spent most of his day asleep, the trio enjoying their evening ritual before getting back to the grind tomorrow. Axel tells them he's being sent on a secret mission, the other two ribbing him on his aloofness. Back at the castle, Cyax accuses Axel of changing and getting too attached to the Keyblade duo. More missions across various Disney worlds occur for the next few weeks, before finally reaching day 149, Axel returning from his stint at Castle Oblivion to meet back up with Roxas at the clock tower, the two wondering why Xion hasn't shown up yet. The next day, Roxas runs into Cyax berating Xion, calling her a mistake that they never should have made. Later on in the day, Roxas is discussing about how people fight for things that they can't bear to lose, namely from seeing how the Beast was fighting for what was most precious to him, while Xaldin mocks that as a weakness. When Axel tells him that they don't have things to protect, mainly because they lack hearts, Roxas points out that even someone like Demyx clearly loves his sitar, even though he lacks a heart. They come to the conclusion that what nobody's prize over all else is likely their memories as somebody's, and Roxas realizes that he couldn't bear to lose his friendship with him and Xion. Oh, how we set ourselves up for disappointment being an integral like this. The next day, Xion is distracted, remembering the events as to her sudden shift in demeanor lately. She ran across none other than Riku on a mission, who demands to know who Xion really is and why she wields a Keyblade after seeing her face. Telling her he dresses in black to ensure his best friend can sleep in peace, he effortlessly defeats Xion, claiming her Keyblade to be a sham and warning her to leave the organization. When she throws the same insult back at him, Riku concludes that he may in fact be the biggest nobody of them all, much to her frustration. Shaking her back into reality, Roxas tries to reassure her that they are both exceptional nobodies according to Xigbar. Xion remains sullen, the encounter really eating away at her. This leads to some amusing conversations in the game about how Axel keeps dodging the questions when Roxas brings up Xion's troubles, claiming that you need to be careful not to press the wrong buttons when dealing with girls, much of which is sadly gone from the HD film here, only summarized like I'm doing right now, I guess. More missions occur over the next few weeks, where Roxas witnesses Hercules training with Phil and Beast fighting to protect Belle. In regards to the latter, Xaldin begins to torment them more and more, a nice lead into the now months-long interference that he had on the world by the time Kingdom Hearts 2 rolled around. Really makes him out to be a sadistic prick. When asking Axel about what love is, Roxas feels his friends avoiding answering the question, claiming that once they have hearts of their own, they'll understand. Soon after, Roxas and Axel hear of Xion failing a mission and falling into a deep sleep, similar to Roxas months earlier. Roxas drops his mission with Luxord to visit her, beginning to lay down a shell at her bedside for each day she remains asleep, reciprocating her actions earlier. Likewise, Axel is on his way to visit Xion when Cyax confronts him, the two sharing tense words at how many secrets they've been keeping from each other lately. When Axel attempts to ask why Xion shouldn't be considered one of their number, Cyax claims that it's plain to see and walks off, confusing Axel. After about 3 weeks of covering for Xion, she finally awakes, Roxas visiting her with both of them feeling quite relieved. Xion wonders how she can feel anything when nobodies don't have hearts, and insists on going with Roxas and Axel on a mission despite their protests. During the mission, she falls unconscious, pivotal moments of Sora's first journey flashing before her eyes. Carrying her back into the castle, Cyax asks if it broke again, causing Roxas to yell that Xion isn't it, to which Axel threatens Cyax to keep quiet. Walking away, Sykes once again iterates that Axel has changed after his sin at Castle Oblivion, wondering aloud if Axel no longer values the past. Whatever friendship they once had before is slowly eroding away. Later in Shion's room, Axel finally admits that Roxas and Shion are his best friends, a big thing for the shady assassin to finally admit after earlier claiming that he had no best friends. Within the following days, Axel begins poring over Vexen's research notes they compiled on Naminé, wanting to get behind the mystery why Shion looks so much like her. Along the way, Roxas begins having adventures in Neverland. Though it's still not on the island itself, at least you get to visit surrounding inlets and even get close to Skull Rock, where Roxas very easily befriends Tinkerbell with startling ease, who very much treats Roxas as an old friend. Axel is eventually sent alongside him on a mission where Roxas shows off how he can now fly, though Axel remains grounded for not quite believing. Through some nice character moments, Axel begins to float once he believes in Roxas, a nice little proof using Peter Pan rules to showcase his trust in his friend isn't all talk. A few weeks pass before we reach day 224, reaching roughly the halfway point through the narrative. We see Diz checking in on Naminé, who seems to be struggling as Sora's memory retrieval seems to be slowing to a crawl. Naminé feels that a nobody is interfering with her abilities to chain back together Sora's memories, suggesting that some memories are being lost somewhere along the way, finding their way into somebody else. Naminé says that if Sora's memories were to become her memories, she'll never survive the process, to which Diz questions who it is. Back on the clock tower, Shion begins to question why she and Roxas are never sent to Castle Oblivion on missions, Axel trying but failing to smooth over the reasoning. After almost falling, Roxas worrying about Shion's well-being, Axel suggests they go to the beach, a personal vacation in an effort to cheer up their depressed friend. Her mind elsewhere, Shion eventually finds out the data Sykes had entered about Castle Oblivion on the organization's main computer, before jumping forward back to where this game began on day 255. In the round room, Sykes is reporting to Xemnas about their status at Castle Oblivion, how he sent Axel for one final sweep of the castle and to return with all of their presents cleared of the facility. With Naminé still missing and someone having access to their main computer, Xigbar plays coy and insinuates he knows where Naminé is, while noting that Poppet is turning into an issue. Xemnas remains confident that Roxas, Axel, and Shion are marching into Destiny's embrace, and suggests being patient and continue to watch matters unfold. When we see Shion entering Castle Oblivion, and before making it even halfway through the entrance hall, she recalls leaving alongside Sykes before collapsing, her head hurting as Axel arrives to take her out of the castle. When Axel warns her that she'll be eliminated if she continues to stick her nose into her past and where it doesn't belong, she begins to accuse Axel of lying, claiming that she has dreams every night and has memories of Axel in Castle Oblivion. Axel denies this, as he couldn't possibly be part of Shion's past. Running past him, Shion attempts to enter Castle Oblivion, before we cut back to the opening of the game, with Axel meeting up with Roxas and showing off his knowledge of the color red. Back in Castle Oblivion, Shion learns about who she was before, Xemnas informing everyone of her disappearance and forbidding anyone going after her. With all that drama, we can now reach the end of the middle act. Now that we're right before everything in the plot begins snowballing forward and begins confusing a large chunk of players and now the audience, it's time for more thoughts and critiques on the gameplay side of this title. While I enjoy Days, its structure is both a blessing and a curse, something that carries over to the next few titles as the series stuck to various handheld systems for a few years. As such, shrinking down, so to speak, switching from the PlayStation 2 over to the Nintendo DS, a few creative decisions needed to happen to balance out the need to retain the gameplay fans expected from the series, but also catering to the on-the-go nature of a handheld. This is mainly why the mission setup and decision to focus on Roxas' time in the organization were chosen. The game can be more structured with clearer goals to better fit a pick-up-and-play style that the DS was perfect for. The pro is that you never have to take too long to get some progress done without hitting a perfect place to save. The con is that it sometimes hurt immersion if you're like me and prefer to hunker down for long sessions when possible, and when a new Kingdom Hearts game on the then established DS came out, I spent many hours grinding out chunks of the game at a time, which led to the aforementioned hand cramps. Seriously, a D-pad for a 3D game isn't ideal for long sessions, especially during more intense boss battles, but the game was semi-designed around an 8-direction movement scheme, so Another side effect of the structure of Days means that repetition does set in. Partially intentional, I admit, but still repetition. Part of the game's method of immersion is getting the player into the repetitive nature of Roxas' missions for Organization 13, but that does mean that the game follows a pattern for a good amount of its runtime. Even watching the HD cutscenes here in the 1.5 remix film will have you intimately familiar with the clock tower and eating copious amounts of sea salt ice cream. This works up to a point, since there are aspects of the game that do admittedly begin to wear thin as the story begins to kick in the further you go. For one thing, this game introduced a metric ton of technically new Heartless, though to be fair a good number of them are the classic RPG staple of simply recoloring and thus buffing them up with slightly different elements and stats. This isn't necessarily a complaint, as it does benefit the multiplayer aspect of the game, plus it does make sense in a gameplay perspective to have variants of such a wide assortment of Heartless, kind of building off of the first 3 games before it. It's not to say that they don't introduce new ones. A good number of new Heartless punctuate pivotal storylines for the various Disney worlds that can be intense and complete damage sinks as bosses. Speaking of, there are absolutely no new worlds introduced in Days, which was slightly disappointing when every other title tends to introduce at least one new world or distinct location, original or otherwise. Though to balance that out a bit, if you're familiar with the level designs of the 2 main numbered entries, you will feel right at home with a good majority of the returning worlds here. Some worlds like Twilight Town return fairly accurately, if not having their more cramped streets widened to better accommodate multiple characters and larger Heartless. While some remain relatively unchanged, some have newer areas, like Beast Castle actually showcasing an extra corridor and the upper chandelier areas to the ballroom. Other worlds have been completely redone, like Wonderland, and actually includes areas like the Queen of Hearts hedge mages, seen aesthetically in Rechain of Memories, and Neverland continues to explore new aspect of the island itself, so it's not like there's no new level design involved. That being said, the music in each world is pretty much all recycled, much of the new pieces coming from the newer story elements and characters, such as Shion's theme, which is one of my favorite pieces in the whole series, and is thus featured multiple times in this video. As far as the other gameplay nitpicks go, I'd imagine the amount of fiddling you need to do can be hit or miss with some fans who are more used to the 2 main Kingdom Hearts titles. In those games, you really only dealt with equipping abilities and selecting a Keyblade alongside any items and magic shortcuts you wanted with an accessory or 2. Here, the handheld games really do require you to at least put some effort into designing your deck, though instead of cards and Chain of Memories, it's selecting what and how much magic, items, and abilities you even have, including what level you're at, which is interesting to say the least. I don't mind the need to focus your approach on the critical path, but I figured I'd mention it here since deck building and Chain of Memories did put off some players to that game's combat system. All in all, it's pretty much all I have to say on the gameplay aspect of this, well, game. Felt I had to say my 2 cents, even if the story is what's going to be more preserved going forward for the near future. If they ever remake this fully in 3D, we'll have to just kind of see, but what we do have now is the story, and how that plays into the gameplay that I can give my thoughts on a bit before returning to that story summary. For starters, one aspect you learn about in Kingdom Hearts 2 is that each organization member shares certain themes and aspects that make them unique. Each represents a different number from 1 through 14, each has a title bestowed upon them, a name that's an anagram of their original selves with an added X in there, an attribute, a specific weapon, and command over a lesser nobody. It's that type of attention to detail to a rogues gallery that I always appreciate, since each is designed distinctly enough that it's not hard to latch on to who's who, even if you have to say, the dude who controls wind, or the one with the book, if the names don't immediately stick. Even in this game, a lot of these guys are still shafted story-wise, even if you do spend more time with the cast that sticks around for Kingdom Hearts 2 in this game. Demyx is still largely an unknown, and remains the most underdeveloped character still even in Days. Others fare a little better, such as Xaldin getting more development into his role in tormenting the Beast in 2, while others like Xigbar and Saïx are elevated to the more important positions that they were hinted at in the previous game. If you wanted to get to know every organization member, I have some bad news for you. Days obviously revolves around Roxas, with glimpses of Axel and Xion as well, and the narrative never forgets its primary focus on its main trio. Considering we only know one character's ultimate fate by the end of 2, it doesn't look good back when Days came out that we'd have a bunch more information on these antagonists and what their personalities and drives were. Not that they didn't serve their purpose as anime villains, but it's not hard to learn which characters were more important to the overall narrative, even if it had to leave half of them behind. Back to my nitpick, Kingdom Hearts 2 introduced nobodies properly, and while we had the lowest tier of nobodies being creepers and dusks, there were higher level nobodies that were under the command of an organization member and were named after job classes in Final Fantasy that related to the member's skill set. Xemnas-controlled sorcerers, Xigbar snipers, Xaldin dragoons, Saïx berserkers, Axel assassins, Demyx dancers, Luxord gamblers, and Roxas samurai. The 5 members who perished in Chain of Memories didn't get to showcase command over their specialized nobodies, since the only nobodies that showed up were the members themselves alongside Marluxia's giant Reaper familiar for his final boss fight. We did have Twilight Thorn as the first real boss for Roxas in his dive to the heart in 2, but this does lead to my one issue with Days. They never let you fight alongside or command Samurai. Since Roxas was known as the dual wielder in 2, so much that his room's door showed his command of both the Oathkeeper and Oblivion Keyblades, more on this later, he doesn't actually dual wield them here thus far. It's obviously coming for sure, but you can tell playing the game that it was going to be a story-focused reveal by this point in the narrative. Samurai wield 2 swords in 2, so I was excited to have them show up in some of the harder fights as computer-controlled AI allies a la Donald and Goofy, but it never happens. You fight a few nobodies in training missions, but that doesn't dissuade what I consider the biggest missed opportunity for that extra bit of story-informing gameplay thing that the series is otherwise pretty okay at. Again, it is a nitpick, but it would have been a nice touch for the single player and would have made some of those heartless bosses with ridiculous amounts of health a little bit easier to bear. Seriously, a few of those fights were tests of endurance, and even the illusion of assistance would have done wonders to psychologically offset some of that grind, while also showcasing a bit of the subtle details that 2 presented in its story. But I do realize that this is a nitpick only I seem to care about. A lot of incidental scenes that use the plotlines from the Disney worlds to help reinforce lessons and aspects of the story are briefly summarized in the HD film here, but some of the smaller scenes that helped hint at future story elements in upcoming games were not retained, but I'm doing my best to highlight a few big examples, such as Xemnas commenting on how Roxas was taken by sleep again, or how Tinkerbell seemingly recognizes Roxas. These aren't vital, and the ones that they did select will give you a lot of the most important scenes, but the tendency to skip all content and 99% of the battles is really jarring as far as the film goes. Again, it's sure to make sure you understand the important parts of Days' story and how the main characters reacted and how it shaped Roxas going forward into Kingdom Hearts 2, but I'm not blind to how disjointed the experience is if this is your only exposure to the game. You really can't win them all here. Oh, side note about some of what you're seeing in these videos. Occasionally, the remixes use upscaled versions of the original cutscenes used in the base games, so when you sometimes see a scene with a character's hair or clothing textures looking blurrier than normal, or they seem to look a little bit off model compared to what you're seeing, this is why. They didn't remaster every scene with the newer models, though it's easier to spot on some of the characters than others. Roxas's hair is a dead giveaway when they don't use his updated model, and Axel's green eyes stand out more when they're using his more recent one. Similar to Chain of Memories, Days is also lip-synced largely to the Japanese scenes, barring a few specific scenes pulled from earlier games, or special treatment if your name is Sir Christopher Lee, so if you're attentive like I am, you just need to largely let it go if you can. Don't worry, the narrative's about to give you way more to focus on than their lip flaps, believe me. Speaking of, the story of this one is about to go all in on referencing previous games, and where it thus starts to lose a lot of the more inattentive or casual/newer players, so I'll briefly return to the plot details once we wrap this up. So let's tackle the rest of the story of Days so I can freely discuss trivia and clarify those details.
What? Then I wasn't who I am?
We enter the final act on day 276, flashing back to the opening hour of the first Kingdom Hearts, Roxas collecting a seashell on Destiny Islands as he seems to spot Xion. Catching up across the bridge, Roxas is then confronted with Zexion instead, talking to Riku, reciting a cutscene in Chain of Memories. Roxas's head begins to ache, falling down before transforming into Riku, and then Sora, before Xion is shown being found by Riku. We then cut to a scene with Riku checking in with Naminé, clarifying the situation. Sora's memories are now escaping into Xion, beginning to become a part of her. Naminé warns that if Sora and Xion's memories become one, it would take even longer for Sora to wake up, something Diz wouldn't allow on his timetable. If Naminé were to simply rearrange Xion's memories directly and implant them back into Sora, he would awaken to find nobody would remember him. Because Roxas and Xion have become their own people, this means that the only way to fully restore Sora completely would be for both of them to disappear. Naminé also reveals that when Xion was first born, her face was blank, and since she's absorbed some of Sora's memories of Kairi, she began to take the form of Kairi, or Naminé as Axel sees her. More on this later, but for now we cut back to Roxas, Axel, and Xion back on Destiny Islands, a familiar image to how we saw Sora, Riku, and Kairi hang out in the first game. Xion wishes to remain, knowing that she likely can't. Roxas meets back up with Axel, claiming he went to Destiny Islands. He says he claims to have seen a girl that looked a lot like Shion, but he didn't get close enough to be sure. Not even positive that Roxas didn't dream it all up, Axel suggests that they use their spare time after their missions to look for Shion. They spend weeks searching for her, before Roxas claims that he's searched every world he's been to on day 296. He then brings up that he's never visited Castle Oblivion, suggesting they go check the one place Roxas hasn't been to. Reluctantly, Axel reveals that Shion came from Castle Oblivion, lying to Roxas about how long he's known this information. Arriving in the entrance hall, Roxas' head begins to hurt the further he goes inside, eventually collapsing, Axel returning him to Twilight Town. Waking up calling out Riku's name, Roxas doesn't remember anything after entering the castle. After suggesting they go back, Shion and an imposter in their robe show up. Roxas and Axel chase them down before losing them in the subway-like tunnels. Axel remarks the imposter was supposedly seen in Castle Oblivion, while Roxas recognized Shion as the other member. The next day, Roxas finally catches up to Shion, relieved and wanting her to return to the castle that never was. She refuses and eventually turns her Keyblade on Roxas, Axel jumping in to forcibly take her back. Confused at the sudden conflict, Roxas yells at both his friends to stop, Shion complying while Axel takes advantage of the situation and knocks her out, slipping into a corridor of darkness, leaving Roxas alone. The next day, Axel is asking Saïx if things are alright as they are now. Disappointed, Saïx asks why, were Axel to save one of the two, why he'd pick the puppet, or putting it another way, why he'd rather lose a real friendship over the one that isn't real. Commenting how Xemnas is getting tired of their constant fixes thanks to Shion's actions, Saïx then addresses his old friend by his original name, Lee, Axel angrily walking off.
Things are finally right again. Of course we're better off this way. Xemnas is exasperated from all the fixing we've had to do. We have to set things right. There's simply too much on the line, Lee.
In the round room, Roxas is questioning Xemnas as to what happened to Shion, before asking who Sora is. Xemnas answers with a grin that Sora is the connection that links Roxas to Shion, and why she's the 14th member in the first place, insisting that Roxas leave her be if he wishes to keep things that way. Roxas is beginning to lose his trust in Axel given his recent actions, and decides to focus on his missions in the meantime. Saïx checks in with Xemnas, asking if they've dealt appropriately with Roxas and Shion. Xemnas admits that while Shion isn't acting entirely according to their plans, she has achieved a few interesting side effects thanks to her abnormal developments. Claiming that Shion was originally an it that was meant to learn from Roxas, such as gaining the ability to use the Keyblade, it began to shape into a she thanks to her absorbing Sora's memories of Kairi via contact through Roxas. While this seemed to Saïx that Shion was a failure at this point, Xemnas realized that it had worked in their favor. Because Shion is absorbing part of Sora's memories into herself by forming her own sense of identity, this means that Sora will stay asleep indefinitely, eliminating his interference as they now control two Keyblade wielders. This explains why the organization didn't look for Sora for the better part of a year. They had two Keyblade wielders that they felt they had control over, while Xemnas then instructs Saïx to ensure that the imposter, aka Riku, doesn't interfere with Roxas and would make Shion's existence incomplete. With all of the hints planted, we finally hit day 300, with Roxas, Shion, and Axel all hanging out at the clock tower for the first time in a long time, no words being spoken. This is the calm before the storm, as Naminé informs Diz that Sora's memory restoration has almost completely halted. Diz affirms that they must take direct action, Naminé protesting before being callously reminded that nobody should never have existed in the first place, something the witch sullenly agrees with. Weeks pass as day 321 arrives. Roxas continues to have more frequent and recurring dreams about Sora, specifically his time at Hollow Bastion and his then heated rivalry with Riku. He wakes up with tears on his cheeks, confused as to what's happening. It turns out that since Shion returned to the organization, Roxas has been steadily growing weaker by the day, as if Shion's power of the Keyblade was strengthening as Roxas began to wane. Shion worries about Roxas, who is amused that the tables have been turned, Roxas usually being the worrywart. Still sore over Axel's treatment over Shion weeks earlier, Shion decides to go confront Axel directly about Roxas' state. There, Axel finally drops the other shoe. He reveals that Shion is a replica designed to mimic Roxas' powers, suggesting that she is stealing more of Roxas' abilities than intended. She then asks him about the boy that looks just like Roxas, this conversation being eavesdropped by Xigbar. The next day, the organization's number 2 convenes with Xemnas, who suggests that it only proves that the puppet is the more worthy vessel, Saïx confirming that the devices will be ready in days. Events are coming to a head, plans taking shape on all fronts, Xemnas determined to obtain Sora's power over the Keyblade. With all the pieces in place, we finally reach day 352 and enter the final week. Xion remembers her conversation with Riku on Destiny Islands. Asking why he saved her, Riku divulges that Xion looks just like Kairi, a very special person to Sora. He confirms that she has been absorbing Sora's memories of Kairi, keeping Sora's resting place a secret for now, and that Xion is preventing Sora from waking. Riku suggests that she go with him to see Sora and end this right now, admitting he's sad that she's been brought into this situation. She declines, wanting to stay with her friends, heeding Riku's suggestion and taking the time to sort out her feelings and to decide the best course of action. Nobodies in Replica sure seem to have a lot of those pesky emotions even though they don't have hearts, don't they? During a specific mission in Halloween Town, Roxas is pitted against an extremely powerful Heartless, fighting with all his might in his weakened state. Before any lethal blows are struck, Axel shows up to block both attackers, revealing that the Heartless Roxas was up against was actually Xion, the both enchanted to see each other as a Heartless. The two Keyblade wielders confused, Axel explains that this mission was deliberately set up to have Xion and Roxas fight each other with the intent on one of them eliminating the other. They return to the clock tower to eat sea salt ice cream, pretending that all the drama lately isn't fazing them, Axel reminding them of the winter sticks that Roxas has picked up months earlier before all these events began to spiral out of control. They admire the day's sunset, tempting fate when Xion suggests that it was the best view in a while. Suggesting they run, Roxas is told that while they have nowhere to go, Axel says that it doesn't matter how long they stay together, but that they make the most of the time they have left, getting it memorized as it were. Back at the mansion, Nominee confirms that Sora's memories are completely halted, setting Riku off to fetch Roxas personally to complete Sora. In the castle, Saïx chastises Axel's constant meddling, saying that they only needed one of them, and that his decision is going to be made regardless. When receiving their missions, Saïx puts Axel and Xion on a team with Xigbar, denying Roxas' request to take Xigbar's place, a sense of unease filling up the nobody as he watches his friends set off on their mission. Later on in Wonderland, Axel is attempting to stop Xigbar and Xion from the fight that had broken out between them, Xigbar amused at seeing a familiar face of the boy who isn't Roxas. Clad in fragments of armor as Xigbar attempts to do battle, he remarks about the boy's specific glare, calling back to the same remark he will give Sora in the opening of Kingdom Hearts 2, the dub here sadly changing the line about, "Why do you always look like I drowned your goldfish?" Still shaken from the blast from the past, Xion is able to sneak up and knock Xigbar out, Axel left confused as to what just transpired. Asking to be let go, she uncovers her hood to show her face, Axel reacting in shock and letting her slip away into a corridor of darkness after she asks him to take care of Roxas. Saïx furiously demands what Axel did to let Xion slip away, Xigbar coming to the defense of the number 8 by claiming he was no match for Xion as well. Saïx bitterly remarking that they're left with the one that they can't use, Roxas is filled in as to what happened. Beginning to be fed up with Axel's lies, Roxas pressures his friend for answers, Axel replying that Xion is a mirror that reflects Roxas, the concept of the replica program falling on Roxas' deaf ears. Infuriated that the organization is left with little choice but to destroy her and seemingly have no use for himself, Roxas storms off to get some clearer answers. Xion meets up with Riku, asking him for some help in what to do next before she loses everything that matters to her. He points her in the direction of the mansion, suggesting that Xion will know Nominee when she sees her. On day 354, Xemnas summons all the members of the organization to lay all their cards on the table, revealing that Xion is a product of the Replica program, the pet project of Vexen, with the intention of duplicating Sora's powers. With Vexen's death, they were set back severely and were taken aback of a replica forming its own identity, Axel leaving out that Replica's similar actions back in Chain of Memories occurred. Xemnas asks Axel to bring back Xion as long as it is still functional. The remaining members who were left in the dark express various degrees of shock and disgust at a puppet existing alongside them for months. While Roxas denies that Xion is a puppet, Saïx retorts that she was never a real member of the organization, directing him to look around the round room. There were always 13 thrones, never 14. Confronting Axel in the lobby, Roxas confirms for himself that Axel had been lying as to how long he's known what Shion actually is, his trust of everyone quickly eroding away. In the forest outside the mansion, the king is confronted by Ansem, Mickey ready to defend himself before Ansem puts on a blindfold and instead sees Riku. Assuring Mickey that he's gaining control of his darkness, Riku tells his friend about what's been going on with the organization, both sharing their information with each other. The king suggests that the organization's been biding their time the last few months, Riku adding that the organization is now in possession of Sora's most vital memories. Riku then swears Mickey to secrecy if anything should happen to him, namely giving into his darkness, that he helped guide Sora, Donald, and Goofy when they awaken if Riku can't be there for them. The following day has everyone continuing to digest all the new information on the replica program, Roxas confused and hurt, reflecting on if he's also a replica and wonders who this Sora is and how he connects to Shion and himself. Roxas decides to confront Axel one more time in an attempt to figure out who he is and why he's considered special, even though the organization wanted him gone after Shion grew strong enough to outgrow his own usefulness. Axel swearing that Roxas was always his best friend, Roxas comes out and asks one more time to find some answers, Axel affirming that finding out the truth wouldn't solve much, asking Roxas to trust him. Fed up and hurt, he doesn't, deciding to leave the organization and find out who Sora is on his own if the organization no longer wants or needs him, leaving Shion with one of his winner's sticks in her room. As Roxas leaves, the scene shown in Kingdom Hearts 2 occurs, with Axel pleading Roxas to not leave on punishment of death, Roxas saying he wouldn't be missed before a dejected Axel admits that he would. Back at the mansion, Shion finally meets up with Namine, asking the witch if she can see Shion's face. More on this soon. Summarizing this conversation, Namine confirms that Shion is Kairi as Sora remembers her, something that leads Shion to feel that she needs to return to Sora to set things right. Namine warns her that if she does return to Sora, she will disappear into him, and since her memories are connected to others, nobody will remember Shion since no trace of her will be able to remain, since she's too interconnected with Sora's memories of Kairi. Shion asks Namine to look after Roxas once she's gone, Diz warping in that an organization member has found them, blaming Shion. Running outside to help keep them safe, Shion finds Axel has tracked her down. Totally fed up by this point on babysitting his friends and cleaning up various messes because they feel they can go against orders whenever they wish, Axel's determined to ensure that he doesn't lose any more of his friends. Returning to the castle with an unconscious Shion in tow after a brief battle, Axel follows suit, Xemnas taking Shion to implement the final stage of his project. Day 357 arrives, but not before I get to point out another cut scene that I really wish remained in the HD film version. After Roxas is leaving, none other than Saïx shows up to prevent him from escaping, leading into one of the final boss battles of the game. This seems insignificant in the long run, sure, since he behaves largely in-game how he did in Kingdom Hearts 2, but man, it was really cathartic to have Saïx be put in his place when he realizes how strong Roxas had gotten, despite being the one that they can't use. It's mainly for this reason that I missed the scene, but I do admit it's more of a nitpick that gives a little win to Roxas before the inevitable ending. This kid isn't going to get a lot of happy resolutions in the next 48 hours, after all. Finding himself atop the clock tower, wondering where he'll even go, Shion arrives, the two sharing one last view of the waning sun. Shion informs Roxas that she's out of time, since she's absorbed so many memories from him that she's filled to bursting. Taking off her hood, she reveals her face now fully reflects Sora's, showing Roxas what he looks like and claiming that she must absorb Roxas to fulfill her purpose, transforming into a multi-stage fight in the game, but at least the HD film has the decency to patch in an additional scene depicting the final phase of this pivotal fight. Gameplay-wise, before this penultimate mission occurs, Roxas is sent to place one of 3 Organization 13 devices. All 3 end up near Wonderland, Halloween Town, and Agrabah's keyholes. The first 3 phases take place near these devices, as Shion transports them to each room and absorbs the power of each device, enhancing her first 3 fights. She seems to be clad in red and white armor, similar to those seen in the secret endings of Kingdom Hearts 2, the silhouette of each resembling Sora. She flies in her first form, the second dealing with slower attacks and most often dodging Ragnarok, while the third form has her charging 4 blades with light in a form most reminiscent of Kurt Ziza. After all 3 are dealt with, it transitions into her 4th and final form, which is where I resume with the cutscenes proper. Roxas is surrounded in darkness, approaching Shion before she transforms into a giant version of herself with 2 massive swords above Twilight Town, a platform of light assisting Roxas in reaching her. A nice little abridged version of the fight occurs, with Shion wielding elements of light, mimicking her connection with Roxas and Sora, and Roxas eventually strikes her down, a beautiful rendition of Shion's theme playing in the background in full this time around, so good job on the editing of this cutscene. With Shion's defeat, the light platform begins to break, Roxas holding his head as his memory of Shion begins to fade, not recognizing his friend he just fought as she begins to crystallize. Shion doesn't regret her choice, however, and Roxas holds her hand in her final moments as he listens to her last wish, sort of confused. I'll let the scene play, since I can't summarize it better than the game itself can.
The one who did this to you?
No. It was my choice to go away now. Better that than to do nothing and let Xemnas have his way. I belong with Sora. And now I am going back to be with him. Roxas, I need you to do me a favor. All those hearts that I've captured, Kingdom Hearts, set them free.
Kingdom Hearts? Free them?
It's too late for me to undo my mistakes. But you can't let Xemnas have Kingdom Hearts. You can't. Goodbye, Roxas. See you again. I'm glad I got to meet you. Oh, and of course, Axel too. You are both my best friends. Never forget. That's the truth.
No. Shion. Who else will I have ice cream with? Shion.
Back at the castle, Axel opens up a letter addressed to him, pulling out a winter stick. The final day arrives, showing Roxas on that fateful night in Dark City as he approaches the castle that never was in an attempt to honor Shion's final wish and free Kingdom Hearts and prevent Xemnas from using it. Now brandishing the Oathkeeper and Oblivion Keyblades, we see him fight off some Neo Shadows alongside Riku, before turning on each other. Riku attempts to take back Roxas on behalf of Diz in order for Sora to wake. Roxas determined to free Kingdom Hearts, find Sora, and retake the life he had for the past 358 days. They fight, Roxas eventually defeating Riku, memories of himself with Axel and Shion flashing before his eyes. During this, Riku hears Shion faintly, struggling to remember her name, as she warns him to stop Roxas, as he's not capable of defeating Xemnas as he is. Riku taunts Roxas, satisfied that Roxas really is Sora's nobody, and ultimately gives in to the darkness within him, transforming his physical shape into that of Ansem, Seeker of Darkness, and overpowering Roxas as Diz arrives to an unconscious Roxas, catching up to the events that led into the opening of Kingdom Hearts 2. We end with Shion soliloquizing that while she may be forgotten, her memory of their time together lives on within Sora. Before the credits roll, Roxas wakes up in the simulated Twilight Town, a normal teenager for now, as he lives out his final week. And that was Kingdom Hearts 358 Days Over 2. It fills in a lot of information that went on behind the scenes of the first trilogy, while also setting up how Kingdom Hearts 2 began and hints at future games. There's a little bit of information that I'd like to clarify since I like my trivia and details before we wrap up. First off, Xion. Days expanded upon Vexen's experiments with the Replica program, one of the many experiments on memory that were being conducted in Castle Oblivion, especially after they discovered Naminé around the same time Xemnas found Roxas. As with most games, Days has Roxas's diary, the Jiminy's Journal allegory, where he recounts many of his playable days, most reiterating his inner thoughts as he grows into his own person, which is kinda nice to read. In my video for Days, I spliced in his diary alongside the game's secret reports where appropriate. I hid the overt reports that spoiled that Xion was a replica for as long as I felt was necessary early on, but I am ultimately proud of my editing there. In the secret reports, it reveals that Xion does follow the whole nobody naming scheme of inserting an X into a name, so what is Xion's? Turns out, it's number I, as in the imaginary number, and her name Xion is derived similar to how Kairi's and Naminé's are. Kairi's derives from sea, Naminé's from waves, and Xion's from tide, because I love naming schemes and pattern recognition. Having it work out for her ID number as a replica is just the icing on the cake, considering she doesn't even exist by the end of this tale, even more so than other characters in the narrative. We may have a story about nobodies in various states of existence, but if Naminé thought she was a true nobody, at least she didn't get forgotten in a bittersweet tale of friendship. It's nice to get the details on why it took a year for Sora to awaken, even though we had no timescale on how long it would actually take for his memories to get back in the first place, just that about a year is really easy to remember for storytelling shorthand. Having another Kairi/Sora running around is just the sort of insanity I signed up for in a convoluted Kingdom Hearts storyline, and I came to really enjoy this trio as they tried to sort out their existential problems. Having her wield the Keyblade alongside Roxas definitely threw me for a lore loop, as my theory that you needed a heart to use a Keyblade was really put under the microscope here. It's implied that Roxas can use the Keyblade because he's Sora's nobody, sure, but Xion was also wielding one at the same time, so does that mean Sora's Keyblade was also being used at the same time in two places at once? Another neat detail. Once Roxas absorbs Xion, he then has the ability to dual-wield both Kingdom Keys, transforming them into the Oathkeeper and Oblivion Keyblades. The symbolism definitely works on multiple levels here. Not only do they represent Kairi and Riku respectively to Sora, they are also emblematic of Roxas's very being, the nobody, moodier side of Sora between light and darkness, while also now doubling for Xion's non-existence, as she was an imperfect replica of Roxas meant to duplicate his powers and become a backup Sora for the organization before being lost to oblivion by the end of the game, as Roxas attempted to keep his promise to her. There's also the matter of how Xion presented herself. In-game, and represented in a few cutscenes here, Xion sometimes seemed to glitch out as she went from unhooded to hooded, sometimes in the same scene. On the DS, I thought my game was simply glitching out, but eventually you realize that it's intentional. When Axel remarked about Xion being a mirror that reflects you, it ties into what Naminé was describing to Riku. Because Xion is a replica, her visage is determined by how each person saw her, which explains why Saïx never treated her as a person or as a she, and already referred to her as an it. To him, she was never nothing more than a doll. Likewise, this is why Xigbar was caught off guard as he saw the Roxas lookalike when fighting her. He was seeing someone else from his past, again putting into question who that character is and why he looks like Roxas. Also, his nickname for Xion was always Poppet. Well played, Xigbar. It's worth noting that in the game, Xemnas also addressed Roxas as if he knew him when he fell into slumber, so maybe that's worth something to keep in mind even though the HD film doesn't address this. This is why, in conversations with Axel when Xion asked him if they were actually friends, she reverts between having no face and looking like Kairi, as once Axel accepted who she was as a person, he finally saw who he recognized as Naminé. Rewatching the movie knowing this stuff is fun. Heck, this applies to the whole series. It's a trip replaying these games the further in you go, seeing all the past hints that get developed in games later. A few other details I appreciate in the story is how Roxas's entire perception of life and friendship consists of the monotonous day-to-day missions he partook in. To him, friendship was hanging out with friends and eating sea salt ice cream. Fun bits of trivia. When Axel first meets Roxas and was showing him the ropes after Xemnas charged him with looking after their new number 13, Roxas was looking at Hayner, Pence, and Olette being friends around town. Axel initially mistook this for wanting the sea salt ice cream they were eating at the time, so he got them some ice cream and went atop the clock tower to eat it, not particularly liking the flavor at first. But as so many things did throughout the year, Axel's cold and shady nature started to slowly melt away at the two kids he was charged with looking after. His development between his first appearance in Chain of Memories and his final portrayal you see in Kingdom Hearts 2 is a neat one. He goes through a similar arc along the lines of a Han Solo, where the gruff, roguish charm of a grey individual slowly gets pulled into being a bona fide protagonist as they're affected by the plights of his friends. And speaking of, the collapse of his friendship with Saïx throughout the game was something, huh? Revealing his original name to be Lee, Saïx had moments of what he would likely consider weakness, where he laments on how his friends seem to change by being in contact with Sora and then Roxas and Xion. The two drifting friends' agenda is never fully revealed here, only brief fragments of Axel's actions in Chain of Memories being recontextualized as necessary initiatives to help Saïx climb closer to the top. His specific elimination of Vexen and Zexion were implied to be under Saïx's will, as Xemnas didn't seem to intend on having Vexen killed as they were in the midst of a replica experiment with Xion. A lot is answered, but plenty of things are left up in the air by the end of Days. The title may refer to a bunch of things, since it's pronounced 3, 5, 8 days over 2, such as the game focusing on the main trio of Roxas, Axel, and Xion. How the 5 could possibly reference the 5 members who were killed early on, or maybe the main trio alongside Mickey and Riku on the cover art. The 8 could be referring to the remaining members of the organization, and adding the 5 before it to the 8 equals 13, which is an important number, and it's all divided over 2, meaning spread across both Roxas and Xion, who are and aren't both Sora, and this is why Kingdom Hearts is a great and frustrating series, since there's so much answered but so much is left implied, and no concrete details for everything exist, like Roxas looks like. Various stints can also be traced doing more math. Roxas being knocked out for a month coincides with Sora's memory being manipulated by Naminé in Chain of Memories, as he awoke right when Sora entered the memory pod at the end of his story. This is when Sora's various pieces of memory begin drifting into Roxas and Xion, eventually preventing him from waking earlier as intended. This isn't present in the movie version, but in-game in some missions, the lower screen on the DS showed Sora mimicking the player's actions on the top screen as Roxas. Nice little flashes like that showcase a novel gimmick using the dual screens, which at least I found a neat use of the handheld's biggest selling point. The scene at the end of the game where Xion begins to vanish in the memories of Roxas and Axel were also played simultaneously during the final cutscene with Roxas and Riku above it, so it had to be stretched out to accommodate for the singular screen most of the series now utilizes. Though it's sad to see it go, it's understandable why they had to change it. Speaking of math one last time, you can further deduce on what days specific events occurred, with day 1 being when Sora impaled himself on the Keyblade of Heart and created both Roxas and Naminé. While this event is evident enough, though going through the secret reports and by paying attention to when the scene with Roxas and Xemnas occurs on the Dark Margin, you can deduce that day 7 is when Xemnas visited Hollow Bastion to see Sora, alerting the Princesses of Heart to his strong presence. Before their fight occurred, Xemnas phases through Sora in a manner similar to how Marluxia did in Chain of Memories. What was happening here is that Xemnas was sampling Sora's memories to use as a blueprint for Xion as a backup should they not be able to use Sora or Roxas going forward to make their artificial Kingdom Hearts. So failsafes on top of backups weaved into contingencies. Xemnas sure did a lot to ensure that he'd have the best chance of creating his Kingdom Hearts with the purpose of using it to become a different entity altogether and to create a new world. A lot of this is elaborated on in the next game, with Days being the interquel, Birth by Sleep is the prequel, so let's wrap this up since that's just about everything I have to say on Days. The last matter I have to talk about was Riku's aforementioned use of the blindfold he had in 2. When he put it on in this game, he was implied to not seeing himself, as if he didn't want to admit that he was fully utilizing the darkness here, as he was turning into Ansem physically, right? So when Mickey said that his eyes couldn't lie in Kingdom Hearts 2, he was basically saying that Riku was willing to function as himself, though he didn't want to admit that he wasn't actually himself, losing his body to, like, Ansem again. It's sort of flowery, and it kind of makes a little bit more sense here, but it doesn't because they don't really dwell on it. Because if you want me to really be another nitpicker again, here it is. Here, it's implied that when he puts on the blindfold, he turns back into Riku, since he can deny where his dark strength is coming from. Though later on when he has to face Roxas, he removes the blindfold and fully embraces his darkness. Though later on you see in Kingdom Hearts 2, when the Kingdom Hearts encoder explodes and it, like, Deus Ex Hearts Riku's body, his body returns, but he still has the blindfold on, even though he took it off. I know it's for the visual and no one else really cares about this, but I wouldn't beat myself if I didn't at least mention it. Okay, moving on. In all seriousness, Days is and isn't one of the more newcomer-friendly entries in the series. It does start off again with Roxas shortly after he was created, similar to how Kingdom Hearts 2 used him, but a lot of the specifics come down to callbacks to the previous 3 games before this one. Certain situations and pieces of dialogue are used to ironic effect in Kingdom Hearts 2, and many of the conversations Roxas has with Axel and Xion are repurposed in his first week in the simulated Twilight Town that sadly echo his previous existence, so that is neat to catch. This isn't one of the games I would personally recommend for a new player to jump into if they didn't have access to the remixes for whatever reason, and found an older copy of the original game. I would recommend Kingdom Hearts Final Mix, Rechain of Memories, and even Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix as entry points over Days, even though a good fourth of 2 won't make complete sense until you go back and learn what led up to it. It's still passable enough that many can jump in there through its sheer confidence in presentation, its excellent gameplay, and all the characters showcased. Even Rechain of Memories is a better place to start, since they do reiterate a bunch of the vital scenes in the first game, even if you won't have complete context as to why that happened. Days can work as your first title, but you are pointed to playing/watching the other 3 games to fully understand what Days is elaborating around. And hey, that's what YouTube is for, and what I'm trying to help with. It's all in the little things that help elevate Days over its many faults. While some scenes may be repetitive and the gameplay even more so, a lot of this commitment does wonders to get you into the mindset of Roxas and how mundane his life in the organization was. For a nobody with no heart, he seemed to sure have plenty of feelings, further putting the nobody question into the forefront of those wondering about the lore and who's telling the truth. From how Roxas sees friendship as sharing ice cream, to showing how everyone was being manipulated and scheming behind each other's backs, Days is quite the ride even for some returning fans to piece together. I appreciate they at least made a film out of the game, so fans won't be left wondering about Roxas and Axel and what they were up to behind the first trilogy of games. A third person, you say? Who? What are you talking about? This was always about Roxas and Axel. Who are you going on about? A lot of the lingering mysteries will be revealed in due time, as many of the hints were for the next game, Birth by Sleep, which I'll cover very soon, and for most watching this in the future, is probably already out, so ignore my dating of this video. I want to take a quick aside to thank all of my new followers I got from this series over the past few months. I've finally reached a whopping 21 followers, which is a paltry number in the grand scheme, but it's a big record for me, so I personally want to thank you all. I hope this overload and focus on Kingdom Hearts has been fun, entertaining, and or enlightening, even if you think it's nonsense. I'm doing my best to have videos out there in obsessive detail so that we're all on the same page once Kingdom Hearts 3 rolls around at the end of January. That's just over 4 months from this video's publication date, so close to having an entire major story arc across 11 games that took close to 17 years to tell is finally coming out. It's exciting stuff, so I hope to see some of you guys in my Birth by Sleep video in a much heftier and more traditional retrospective. 4 titles down, 7 more to go.